Here we go, the last session. Right, I'm going to share my screen again, as usual. And let's get this one underway. There's another area of new scientific thought that's cast light on spirituality. And this goes to the heart, really, of kind of what Christianity is about. It's to do with fields and forms, or what causes us to take the form that we do. As I've already said, modern physics understands that we exist in a whole variety of energy fields containing information that determines the form of our physical existence. Now, all forces and energy have to have a medium through which they travel by vibrating that medium. So water waves are energy traveling through water. Sound waves are energy traveling through air. Water and air could be called the fields through which the energy of the waves travels. We also exist in a gravitational field that fills the whole universe. It's a big one. It causes a force of attraction between any two bodies. The bigger the body, the bigger the force. The Earth, being a large body, has a very large gravitational force that holds us on the surface. Otherwise, we'd simply fly off into space. The moon's gravitational pull creates our tidal system. And it's all transmitted through the universal gravitational field. Now, you may at school have done a simple experiment with magnet and iron filings, which illustrates the presence of a magnetic field. Iron filings are simply sprinkled on a piece of paper, making no discernible pattern until a magnet is brought up under the paper and the paper's tapped gently. Lo and behold, the iron filings rearrange themselves into a clear pattern of concentric curves coming out of the poles of the magnet. The iron filings are influenced and rearranged to conform to the invisible magnetic field. You see, fields are influencing us all the time. We exist in the electromagnetic field mentioned earlier, medium through which all electromagnetic radiation passes. That's microwaves, radio waves, television waves, infrared light, X-rays, gamma rays. The only difference between these forms of electromagnetic energy is the level of vibration, the frequency. Electromagnetism is intimately involved in all the interactions in our daily lives. It's the force between electrically charged particles of the atoms from which all matter is made. It's the sun's energy by which oxygen is created in green plants to enable us to live. It's the energy by which radio, television, mobile phone, Wi-Fi signals are conveyed, by which we're all meeting here today. The electromagnetic and gravitational forces are two of the four known fundamental forces. The other two are the strong nuclear force, which holds tiny bundles of quarks and atomic nuclei together, and the weak nuclear force, which causes certain forms of radioactive decay. And all other known forces, like friction and so on, are derived from these fundamental forces. Note, I stress on known forces. We can't assume there are no other fundamental forces, only that these are the ones we can detect. These are the ones that have a theory about. To assume there's nothing else outside of known science is bad science. How we progress is by somebody coming up with an idea, testing it, and seeing if it works. And if it works, then we have a theory that's got evidence behind it. If we consider the electromagnetic field, like the gravitational field, it's all-pervading, and it's thought to be a means of communication within the body. We emit electromagnetism ourselves. We mentioned it earlier, it's detected by MRI scans, etc. So we're surrounded and immersed in a sea of vibratory energy, of which we can only see and feel a small part, heat and light. We also exist within the magnetic field of the Earth, which various animal species use for guidance in ways not yet fully understood. There are also all various kinds of fields at the level of the particles of matter, such as the electron field and the neutron field. So there are fields within fields within fields. Fields are all around us and within us. It doesn't take much of a leap of imagination to suggest that there are other fields that we can't detect because we've not yet devised the instrumentation to detect them or the theories to even start looking for them. These may have a profound effect on us and be an explanation for many of the puzzles of life. There are fields, determining and governing the reactions and the phenomena that we see and can measure in the physical world. It's the pattern of life. And this understanding is helpful not only to physicists, but to biologists as well. One field affects another, influences another. We know what resonance is when one source of vibrational energy sets off another. So like a piano is playing in a room and a guitar standing in the corner will set some of its strings vibrating in resonance, the ones that are on the same frequency. Now, Sheldrake applies this kind of idea to his understanding of morphic fields. He proposes that there are fields within fields within fields, and so that the growth and form of each part of the body is determined by its own section of morphic field. And so a cutting from a branch of a plant will conform to its field, will be shaped by it and start growing roots, because that's what it's got to become, drawn by the field. A flatworm can be chopped into small pieces and each piece will grow into a new flatworm, determined by its morphic field. I'm glad that doesn't happen with human beings. But furthermore, he proposes that each species has a field for the whole species. And that whole field has a kind of built-in memory that stores information relevant to that species. So every species has a sort of extended mind, which is contributed to by all members of the species. And it determines not just its form, but also its behaviors, its social and cultural systems, and its mental activities, all contributed to in the morphic field. This field memory is cumulative, so it builds up based on what's happened to the species in the past, shaped by the experiences and the behavior of all the previous generations. And these can be considered as fields of information based on the biological evolution of that species. It's similar to the idea of collective unconscious put forward by Carl Jung. So morphic resonance is the concept that an individual organism can be influenced by the behavior of another organism of the same species, despite having no physical connection or contact with it, because there's a connection through the morphic field of that species. So any new development or behavior by one individual becomes part of the morphic field, and the expectation then is that it will be easier for any other member of the species to acquire that new skill or habit that has been learnt by a member or several other members of the same species. He applies this not only to living organisms, but also to things like protein molecules and crystals, and even to atoms. He actually puts it like this. For example, if rats learn a new trick in London, then rats everywhere should be able to learn the same trick more quickly than they could before, because the rats have learnt it in London. The more rats that learn it, the easier it should be for rats to learn it everywhere. Likewise, if a chemical compound is crystallized in New York for the first time, the more this is done, the easier it should become for these crystals to form all around the world. And even if children learn to play a new video game in Japan, it should be easier for children to learn the same thing in other countries. These effects should happen without any normal means of communication. Now, this sort of thing has been experimentally observed with a variety of species. Sheldrake gives some examples. Here's just a couple of them. For example, Pavlov did an experiment with white mice, and he trained them to run to their feeding place when a bell was rung. Now, the first generation of mice took an average of 300 trials to learn this new behavior, but by the fourth generation, it was right down to 10 trials before they learnt it. Now, another scientist, William Mcdougall, back in the 1920s, he did a comprehensive experiment with rats in a maze in which they had to learn which exit to come out of. The illuminated one gave an electric shock if they exited that way, but this was the sneaky bit, really. They kept changing which one was illuminated. It was back in the 1920s, I hasten to add. Now, the first generation of rats made an average of 165 errors before learning which exit to take. By the 30th generation, only 25 errors were being made before they learned the new behavior. And following the publication of this, another biologist at Edinburgh University, Francis Crewe, he decided to repeat McDougall's experiments, but found that his first generation of rats learnt very quickly with only an average of 25 errors, as if they'd continued where McDougall's rats had left off. And then in Melbourne, the other side of the world, in Australia, the experiment was again repeated with 50 generations of rats over 20 years, and it showed the same pattern. And they also showed that experiments with rats whose parents were totally untrained, so there's no genetic passing down heredity, they found a similar improvement as if the information had become accessible to them as well. And these remarkable kind of results are what would be expected to conform to Sheldrake's theory of morphic resonance. Now, as a theory, it was received initially with great skepticism by many, and Sheldrake actually had to put up with a lot of ridicule about it, but it's actually gaining support from many corners. And Einstein put up with ridicule for his theory of relativity until it gained acceptance. This falls outside of reductionist science. There isn't a hard scientific theory of what the morphic field is and how it can be detected, but the experimental evidence suggests its existence. So I thought about this. I was fascinated by it a number of years ago now. But applying this theory to human beings means that whenever a human being does something which goes further than anyone has gone before, it effects a change in the morphic field for the whole human race. And it makes that act more possible for everyone to do. Now we can begin to see that effect in various human achievements. Since Hillary and Tenzing climbed Mount Everest, many are doing it every year, and there's now queues. You can see the queue here, queues to get to the top, as you see in this photo. Crazy, crazy. But since Bannister broke the 4-minute mile, it's consistently broken regularly. Since the English Channel was first swum, it's been accomplished time after time. But it's obvious that these are all affected by other factors as well. Improved nutrition, fitness levels, better training, an increased field of selection, technological advances. Another example is the constant cry of examination boards in Britain, that exams are no easier than they were years before, yet the pass rate is much higher. Is it solely due to better teaching? Does morphic resonance have an effect as well? It's very difficult with human beings to filter out the effects of all sorts of other factors and isolate what could be put down to morphic resonance. But I thought, well, let's assume for a moment that this is actually the way nature works. And the theory of morphic resonance has profound implications for understanding the life and death of Jesus and the theology of atonement. Christian theology tells us Jesus was fully human. Therefore, what he did and how he behaved would affect the morphic field of humanity and enable others then to do the same. In fact, in the Gospel of John, Jesus says as much. Very truly, I tell you, the one who believes in me will also do the works that I do, and in fact will do greater works than these, because I am going to the Father. Now, when we look at Jesus's path in life, we see this one of kenosis, or self-emptying. In Philippians 2, Paul first applies this word to Jesus, but it is precisely the path that Jesus took. He said, let the same mind be in you that was in Christ Jesus, who, though he was in the form of God, did not regard equality with God as something to be exploited, but emptied himself. Now, in modern psychological terms, we might say that Jesus was able to transcend his egoic desire nature, his false or lower self, and awaken fully into God consciousness, his true or higher self. And yet he was fully human, the same as us. So he must have had a lower desire nature. He's not just God in disguise, he was fully human. And the story of his years of ministry show him going repeatedly beyond that ego, beyond that self-centeredness, to become one with God, fully divine, or the way I like to understand it, as fully divine as a fully human being can be. That's one to think about. That's how I see it now. Jesus repeatedly emptied himself and surrendered to this process of kenosis. It's in a way, it's the meaning of Jesus's cryptic words, those who lose their life shall find it. We're to let go of our lower egoic desire nature and awaken into our higher self. And we see this in the story of Jesus, the temptation narratives in Matthew chapter 4. Jesus tempted 3 times. Firstly, to change rocks to bread, to use his powers selfishly and for his own ends. Secondly, to throw himself from the pinnacle of the temple and let the angels catch him. The temptation to use sensationalism to gain a selfish, ego-boosting following. And lastly, he was tempted to worship Satan in exchange for selfish power and prestige. And in each case, Jesus responds by simply letting go of the bait being dangled, content to follow the path of surrender and emptying himself of the egoic desires for more. Jesus wasn't concerned about power, adulation, or prestige. He'd gone beyond the need for them. He'd let go of his ego and was full of that compassionate consciousness of God. And we see this egoic surrender again in the Garden of Gethsemane and in his trial and crucifixion. As Jesus faces what he has to go through, he's tempted to give it all up. Yet, not my will, but yours, he said to God. He surrendered to the process. He put his ego aside. And that self-emptying kenosis continued in his reactions to the process of the trial, the torture, and the crucifixion. It was a path he was establishing to act out of the love and compassion that became his as he put aside his egoic nature and awakened into this immense field of God's compassionate consciousness. I believe he acted and was energized from the deep well of love, the ground of our being that is God. And the implication is that this is possible for all humanity. He was modeling for us a path of transformation for us all. And I think if we consider this in terms of morphic resonance, Jesus was the first to fully follow the path of transformative love. And in doing so, he forged the path and changed the morphic field for all humanity. And so that has made it more possible for all of us to rise beyond the ego and have this mystical experience of connection with the compassionate consciousness of God. In his life and his death, Jesus modeled this way for us. He was a way shower. And one new insight that this idea of morphic resonance can give us is that, well, the other great teachers and masters, both within Christianity and all the other religions, will all have contributed their parts to the change in the morphic field of humanity as well. So the Buddha, Confucius, Lao Tzu, and so on, have all those who have reached the spiritual heights and depths, they take their place in the picture. And so, to my mind, it means that Christianity ceases to be exclusive, and we can see the part that all the other faiths play as well. That seeming exclusivity has caused so much war and death in the past as Christianity has defended itself to literally the sword hilt. The other side of the coin, of course, is that negative contributions will have made an effect as well in the morphic field. Although I think they are at a much lower level of energetic influence. Atrocities committed by human beings will affect the morphic field. And so it then depends, and we touched in on this earlier, it then depends on what level of energies we align ourselves with. If we align with the lower vibrations in the morphic field, we will live out those lower desires. And the whole focus of Christianity and most other world religions is towards the higher vibrations of love and compassion. As Jesus expressed it, we are to love God, and to love our enemies, and to love ourselves. And he said, we will be known by our love. And the more we focus on this, the more we inject it into the morphic field. It's the biblical injunction to focus on the good, the noble, the lovely, and think on those things. What we do, how the attitudes that we hold, that we contain, we put out into the morphic field. And I think this all begins to tie together a modern scientific concept with atonement theology. The traditional summary, of course, that's worked for the pre-scientific worldview is that we're separated from God because we fall short of perfection and are therefore sinners, and we fall under God's judgment for sinning. And it then follows that Jesus in his death bought us back. He paid the price, died for our sins, and we are thus redeemed. And I think in the new understanding, we can rephrase that. The separation from God, which is what sin really is, being separated from God's ways, it's as a result of being centered in the ego self that's individualized out from the God consciousness at the core of our being. It's as if we've become so self-aware that we've lost our God awareness, and we're suffering the consequences of the self turned in on itself. And we see here, in this slide, the way in which the ego seeks everything for itself, and the way in which the soul, the divine part of us, seeks to give to others and to love and serve. What Jesus did is that he bought us back, not merely by his self-offering of love at the point of death, but by his whole life. The way in which he led a life of compassion and kenotic self-surrender, means that he changed the morphic field of humanity and enables us all to follow the same path. It's not so much that he bought us back, or that he brought us back. He showed us the way. And we move the theology, the emphasis of the theology of atonement, to actually awakening to love and becoming followers of the way of Christ, which is what Jesus called for, to follow me. And the Christian spiritual journey then becomes to follow the compassionate, transformative path of loving surrender and kenosis that Jesus blazed and enabled for us to follow. And just to finish, what's the best practice to enable that to happen? Hopefully you all know the answer: meditation. It's the way in which we let go of the ego and allow the Spirit of God, the Spirit of Christ, to enter into our lives and change us to be able to follow that transformative path.